Hey everybody, 2 Kings chapter 3 preserves a story about Adonai, the God of Israel, being defeated in battle by Chemosh, the patron deity of the nation of Moab.
This is part 2 of my response video to Dan. A couple months ago, he made a video claiming that Yahweh lost in battle to another god. I critiqued that video, and yesterday he posted a 2-part response video. This video is addressing part 2 of his response. If you have not seen the video addressing part 1, it is the video I posted right before this one. So in the last video, I defended the idea that the wrath mentioned in 2 Kings 3 is from Yahweh. And I mentioned that one reason someone might suggest Yahweh would be mad is because the nature of the warfare described contradicted the rules of warfare that Yahweh provides in Deuteronomy 20. Now, I noted that there are some difficulties with this idea, such as why would God prophesy these things and then get mad about them being done? And I offered the suggestion that it might be that this is to be understood as a prediction of what will happen and not a command of what they should do. The following is Dan's response to that suggestion.
There are 2 reasons that this accounting of this passage is unlikely. Now, first, while it is true that a prediction and a command can be morphologically indistinguishable, the syntax of 2 Kings 3:19 suggests it is a command. The first clause begins with a wekatal verb, and the second clause has the objects fronted and then a yiktol verb after that. This is supportive of understanding this as an imperative, and even scholars who want to understand this as a prophecy say it is a prophecy that comes in the form of a command.
So in regard to Dan's first point here, there's nothing about the syntax that Dan just described that requires this to be understood as a command and not merely a future-looking description. The stylistic shift may indicate that this is an imperative, but to suggest that it's conclusive is overstepping. Second, it's worth noting that the wekatal verbs and yiktal verbs are used in the verses preceding this to describe things which are most likely not a command but are merely future-looking. If Dan wants to provide sources to make an argument for why this syntax strongly indicates a command only, I'm open to hearing it and I'm open to conceding this point. However, at this point, I simply see no evidence for this. Let's look at the second argument he gives.
Second problem is that it would be entirely uncharacteristic of the Hebrew Bible for God to offer a prophecy about delivering Moab into their hands and then immediately explain things they're going to do that are going to cause the prophecy to be negated.
So the problem with this argument is that Dan is assuming that this prophecy is negated or that it is unfulfilled. However, as I argued in my previous videos, the prophecy was fulfilled. So Dan's argument doesn't get started here. I also find it funny that Dan appeals to the normal mode of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible and says that this would be an anomaly. You know what else would be an anomaly, Dan? Is if the Hebrew Bible was depicting a foreign god as being stronger than Yahweh. But you have no problem with anomalies on that front. It's also funny that when I note how Yahweh is normally described in the Hebrew Bible, you tell me I can't do that because it assumes univocality. But then Dan turns around and is fine with using other uses of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible to argue that my view would be an anomaly. Well, which one is it, Dan? Either we can take the rest of the Hebrew Bible into account when interpreting this verse, or we can't. I'm not going to let you have your cake and eat it too. I then offer a reason for why it might be the case that if the offense was the violation of Torah mandated warfare, why the wrath is said to come across them when it did. And Dan offers 2 responses to this. So let's see the first one here.
So 2 concerns with this rhetoric. To begin, this absolutely was not immoral warfare. As I explained in the previous video, cutting down Moab's fruit-bearing trees didn't violate any legislation anywhere in the Hebrew Bible.
I have already addressed why Dan is wrong about this not being a violation of the Torah warfare rules in my last video, and I do want to mention that the same commentary that Dan cites in his video, which is the Anchor Bible commentary on 2 Kings, the authors also explicitly say this would constitute a violation of the laws of warfare in Deuteronomy 20. That is in the same sentence that Dan quotes from earlier, so I think Dan's selective deference to them is amusing. Now, the next critique Dan gives is to just say that's asinine, but that's not an argument whatsoever, so there's really nothing for me to respond to here. Before I move on, I want to point out that if I'm wrong about this, great. That would show an issue in the reason for Yahweh's wrath that I mentioned, but there are other reasons that scholars have proposed for why Yahweh might be mad at the Israelites. such as the Israelites' role in the sacrifice offered by the Moabite king. And I actually find that explanation stronger. However, I think this option I mentioned about unlawful warfare does have enough merits that it is worth mentioning, and Dan has not sufficiently refuted it yet. So next, in my original video, I mentioned that Dan is ignoring scholarly discussion on this passage and just presenting his view as if it's the most obvious. And this is what he says in response. And then he just presents his view as if it's the obvious one.
Well, it is. And as I have stated many times, it is the only reading that does not require we gin up a bunch of scenarios that are not in evidence just to skirt around the plain meaning of the text. And the only reason there is significant debate is because there are a lot of scholars who dogmatically refuse to accept the plain meaning of the text.
No, Dan, it's because the view you are offering has significant problems. You are inserting a character into the text who was never mentioned. You are suggesting that the author wrote something about their God, which would completely contradict how his culture regularly depicts their deity. Your interpretation is that the author violates the norms of interpreting defeat as their God being mad at them, which is something you explicitly admit is the norm in your first response to me. Your view involves a violation of the norm that everywhere else this noun is used, it is referring to something coming from Yahweh alone. And then after doing this, everybody just left it in there. Like the Hebrew scriptures, which are filled with all these redactions, supposedly. But nobody bothers to redact this verse that, according to you, so obviously depicts their God as being defeated. Your view has problems. If you want to say my view has problems, great, I'll hear them. Your view has problems too. It is not the most obvious reading of the text. It is the reading of the text that fits with the narrative you are trying to convey. So a significant chunk of Dan's video at this point is just him using rhetoric about me going by the apologetic playbook of ginning up slivers of possibility, which is not a counter-argument. This long ramble does nothing to present actual difficulties in the alternative interpretations that I have offered, nor does it do anything to deal with the problems in the interpretation Dan has offered. It is just him, again, setting up his own view as the default while ignoring the difficulties with that view, and then claiming that everybody who dares disagree with him is doing so for nefarious reasons. Dan, I sincerely like you as a person, but you really need to grow up and stop saying this nonsense. You are not the only scholar in the world. You are not the only person who approaches the text seeking to find its most likely meaning. If you think other scholars are wrong or implausible, great, whatever. However, suggesting that every scholar who proposes these alternatives is doing so because of intellectually dishonest reasons, and only you have come down from the ivory tower to grace us with your objective, unbiased, perfect analysis is arrogant and it is asinine. It's at this point that I will note that insulting other scholars and accusing them of being intellectually dishonest when they disagree with him is also part of Dan's normal rhetorical strategy. So next, next I point out that Dan's interpretation is inferior to mine because it goes against the depiction given of Yahweh, given in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. This is Dan's response.
So two concerns here. It presupposes univocality to insist that our reading should align with the rest of the Hebrew Bible.
This is wrong. Nothing about my response assumed univocality. If we have a collection of texts which come from a nation and a culture which regularly depicts its God as above all others, that is relevant data to when we approach 2 Kings and try to assess the most likely intent of the author. Rejecting univocality will not save you here.
And also, this is just ginning up scenarios that are not in evidence and don't align with ancient literary conventions associated with divine warfare.
Two things to note here. First, you can't point your finger at me and say I'm ginning up scenarios when you're inserting a character into the text that is never mentioned. There is no evidence in this text that Kamash is involved in any way. Second, notice what he just said about me contradicting norms of ancient warfare. Before I address this, notice what Dan said in his last video to me.
Rationalized their military losses based on whatever was rhetorically helpful and exigent. And so usually it had to do with saying Adonai was punishing them or was angry.
So Dan admits that usually the people would interpret their defeat as their God being angry with them or punishing them. Dan admits that this is a norm of ancient Near Eastern divine warfare. My position is that Yahweh, the God of the defeated nation, was mad at them, and that this is what the author was conveying. So according to Dan, my view aligns with the ancient Near Eastern norms of divine warfare. And when Dan comes in and says, no, this is actually Israel recording that their God was defeated in battle, then according to Dan himself, he is the one whose views do not align with divine warfare norms. Thank you, Dan, for helping me make my case. I could not have done it without you.